The interesting irony of such a short time frame is that it doesn't help the decolonizing process, you know, and relationship building. And
Okay. Shall we begin?
Sure.
Teoti.
Yeah, Sean. Whakatakatahau ki te uru. Whakatakatahau ki te tonga. Kia mā kina kina ki uta. Kia mā taratara ki tai. Ehi a ke ane te atakura. He tio, he huka, he hauhu. Tihei mauri ora. Kia ora. We can now move on.
Thank you.
And what a baby, Ipnaladi, Munamale visis nisu savon, Molenechi bel sapnilas, Yalan mede Irlanda lesogas, Ernomus gitu Ipnel, Yamuveki, Milet siema dillis, Moi fortito vedrase bargadan vuesta mi bordito si dilemma, gitu Itnad Ipnel, Chimigwech Kichimanido, Mawaji and Azukane Chige Nindijna cause, Ninsami and Irish, Kitchener on Dayan. Chimigwech Nin in Ardizawan, Wadozum Nin Gueco Bamatsoan. Chimigwech Kichimanido. And I give thanks to the Creator for my life, for all that is in creation, for teaching me about how we are all created in the circle of life. I often think about all my relations, and no being is left out of that. I think about the standing people, that's the trees, the plant people, the winged ones, the creepers, the crawlers, the flyers, the swimmers, to the sky people, the star people, to grandfather sun who lights our day, even on a rainy day, grandmother moon who shines at night, Father Sky, and our first mother, Mother Earth, who provides for all the beings. And so I give thanks for those teachings. And I wanted to do a practice that I have been taught over 30 years ago, and that it is a part of my life. It's an Anishinaabe teaching that has been passed to me. And it's the lighting of sage. And I offer this smoke for those who choose to receive it. No one has to take it. I wouldn't want to impose this on anyone, but this is a way of cleansing. And I clear my eyes so that I see good things, and I see maybe truths I haven't seen before. I clear my ears to hear good things. I clear my mouth so that I speak in a kind, respectful way. And I clear my heart so that I'm open to receive good things and truths that maybe I'm not aware of at this moment. So I offer this smoke to all of you who choose to receive this cleansing as well. And I wanted to offer a song to you with my drum. Gonna smudge that. And this song was given to the drum circle where I'm a song carrier, and that was passed to me by an elder over 16 years ago. And this song comes from Anishinaabe elder Jake Pine, and he called this song either the 8th prophecy or the an invitation song. But it was to, there's a word in there called ombe, and it means come in, you're invited into this space, come in before you forget how to be a good human being. So it's really a call to Indigenous and settler peoples to find their way to each other and to build those better relations. So it's with that intent that I sing this song. to migrants.
Thank you. Thank you, Kelly. Thank you, Teoti, for opening our hearts and setting us, I think, in a good way to have a good conversation. It's an honor to be here with the five of you. We're going to each introduce ourselves to begin. This is a discussion. I'm just going to look at my notes because I forget what the name of the panel is, because I know what I want it to be. I've lost it on my pages. Reciprocity in community music, practicing cultural humility. My name is Deanna Yarachuk. I'm holding space here for the panel. What we'll do is we'll each introduce ourselves in terms of our names and our affiliation where we live. We'll also try to deepen that sense of self-location through acknowledgements about the land we sit on and where our ancestry is from as well. And I maybe would invite Teoti to begin since you opened with ceremony, if you wouldn't mind.
Ngā toki matawhārua rātou ko Aotea ko takitumu o ku waka. Ko tariwha rātou ko taranaki ko tamatia o ku maunga. Ko manamuka rātou ko taipora inui ko te wheke o ku whenua. Te ui o tau nei I tēnei rā, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. My name is Teoti Rakina. I work on the Faculty of Creative Arts and Industries at the University of Auckland in New Zealand, or in our language we say Aotearoa or Nui Tireni. My day job is teaching classical voice in the School of Music, a school of music based on the traditions of Western Europe. However, I am Maori, and we are Polynesian mariners who migrated across the South Pacific to New Zealand before colonization by the British. And implicit within that label is an understanding that I belong to an Indigenous collective that has, like so many, a complicated colonial history, but specific to our context. So I'm here on this panel, and I occupy spaces internationally and globally, often in the music education world, because as a part of that community, I have an obligation and responsibility to tell our stories and participate in discussions that may bridge gaps in perceptions and understandings of non-Western ways of thinking. So kia ora to everyone, and thank you for the opportunity. Deanna, you're muted.
Kelly, would you like to introduce yourself next? Thanks, Teoti.
Greetings, everyone. So I'm Kelly Lorla, and I'm a lecturer at Wilfrid Laurier University and the University of Waterloo in Waterloo and Kitchener, Ontario, Canada. And I grew up in Northern Ontario, was born there on Treaty 61 territory, which is land of the Anishinaabe and Cree peoples, over 93,000 kilometers worth of land and over 24 Indigenous communities. My grandfather is Sami and from northern Finland, and he came over in the 1920s and settled in Northern Ontario. So I recognize that he was colonized in his home country, but came to Canada, and he was part of the colonizing project because he settled on Indigenous territories, the land stolen from Indigenous peoples. And now I live in Southern Ontario and the Haldimand Tract Treaty, where the Haudenosaunee people only have 4.9% of their original territories. So I recognize I am living on stolen land, and I am a colonizer, settler, as well as I'm colonized Indigenous because of my Sami Indigenous settler heritage. It's a conflicting place to be sometimes, but that is who I am. Miigwech.
Thank you, Kelly. Actually, Nikki or Gerard, I wonder if maybe one of you would like to go. Nikki, would you be ready?
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name's Nikki Kazimzadeh, or Nicole, as my screen says. I am of English, Irish, and Scottish heritage. My paternal grandfather was the first in his family to be born here from England, and the rest of my family are third or fourth generation from England or from Ireland and Scotland. I'm an elementary music teacher. I teach kindergarten to grade 6 music here in Waterloo, Ontario. And I just completed my master's at Wilfrid Laurier University, where Deanna and Gerard were both my professors. And that's kind of where I'm coming from here. But I'm also continuing to do some research at Laurier because I am really interested and passionate about community music and also music education, and that the need for change, like enormous change within those fields. Thanks.
Thanks. Gerard?
Hi, thank you. That was wonderful. My name is Gerard Young, and I'm, as Nikki and Deanna have indicated, and Kelly, that I'm in Waterloo, Ontario, and have had the opportunity and pleasure and honor of working with these people with some pretty important things. I'm originally from California. I'm California Chinese American, and on my mother's side, Jamaican Chinese, so with a Caribbean background. And also, besides having formal training through a doctoral degree in Western music and conducting, I've been traditionally trained in several types of music, especially in Zen Buddhist shakuhachi, Japanese music. I serve as an assistant professor in community music at Wilfrid Laurier University in Canada.
Thank you. Jillian.
Thanks. Thank you to everybody. And it is similarly a privilege and an honour for me to be part of this conversation and this panel. I'm Jillian Howell. I'm one of the CMA commissioners, and I work as a research fellow at the Faculty of Fine Arts and Music at the University of Melbourne. And I live in the city of Melbourne, or its traditional Indigenous local name is Naarm. And I live and work and was born on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations. And in Australia, the traditional owners, there is no treaty with the traditional owners, so this is a stolen land that was never ceded. My family heritage is British, Irish. I'm a first generation Australian. My parents immigrated here in the 1960s. Both of them were born in World War II London and were eager to escape, I imagine, the sort of grey austerity of post-war recovery there. And my mother always talks about her love of Neville Shute novels, and that was what made her want to travel to Australia, Neville Shute. I've been working in community music for, I think most of my music career actually, and I've always been interested in the power dynamics of music, community music and community music leadership, and that relationship between music leaders or community musicians and communities. Often in my work, I'm working in communities that I'm not automatically a member of. So it's been a question that's really challenged me and fascinated me for a long time. So that's what brings me to this conversation as well.
Wonderful, thank you, Jillian. So you met me, I'm Deanna Yarachek. I am also in the Waterloo region along with Kelly and Nikki and Gerard, also at Wilfrid Laurier in community music. My ancestral background is my father is Ukrainian. That's where Yarachek comes from. And his grandparents immigrated to Western Canada, to Alberta in the early 1900s. And my mom is Scottish Irish in Ontario along the St. Lawrence River, which is known as Loyalist country. That's and my mom's family is definitely a part of that loyal to the British Empire, in case you're wondering what they're loyal to. So that is a history that makes me uniquely me. And I'm really honored to be hosting this conversation between all of us today. We are wanting to talk about reciprocity, about being in relationship. We've already exchanged a number of emails amongst us, and the focus on being in relationship is a clear, a very important piece that really guides the conversation that we're having, and I think the work that we are all doing in our own parts. And actually, speaking of, I just also wanted to name that ancestral acknowledgement, sort of acknowledge where we're from. For me as a white person, I think a number of us as white people are as settlers, meaning people who came kind of are from away and kind of settled on this land, or our past folks did. It's not something we normally do, and yet it's something that's really important. It's a practice that I learned from Fanis Juma, who's a racial advocate in the African, Caribbean, and Black community here in Waterloo region, to really name where we are from, to acknowledge our own ancestral backgrounds, and to know we are a part of a history and a tradition, to locate ourselves there. And actually, Nikki, I don't know if I could put you on the spot, but you found some beautiful quotes from an Indigenous perspective around the importance of self-location. And I just wonder if do you have a quote with you, or do you remember a little bit of that?
Sure. So this quote particularly comes from this book here. It's an Indigenous Methodologies book by Margaret Kovach, and in my master's research, I did quite a bit of reading on Indigenous methodologies, being that I was working with Indigenous collaborators and Indigenous themes. And so in this quote, she talks about the importance of self-locating as an Indigenous person herself, but also as a researcher. So she says, critically reflective self-location gives the opportunity to examine our research purpose and our motive. It creates a mutuality with those who share their stories with us. Critically reflective self-location is a strategy to keep us aware of the power dynamic flowing back and forth between researcher and participant. It prompts awareness of the extractive tendency of research, and it endorses tending to the personal and the cultural in research. I included maybe a less couth quote from Sean Wilson's book, Research is Ceremony, which I really love. And it basically alludes to the fact, I can't remember the exact quote, but it alludes to the fact that there is no such thing as objective research. It does not exist. And as a researcher, it's incredibly important to locate ourselves in every situation and to be aware of who we are in the research, because that frames completely the way that the research or the experience goes. And this goes for community music making, my role as an educator as well, I think. So.
Great, thank you. I do want to turn it actually over to Teoti and Kelly, who I think your the ceremony that you opened with, which I'm so grateful for, that sense of locating self is more of the practice. But so I don't want to speak on your behalf, but I'm just aware of the fact that this practice of locating ourselves is a new practice for those of us who are white, or it's newer for me. And the idea of cultural humility, which is in the title of this presentation, that strikes me as an instruction for white folks, in terms of about how do we make sure we are keeping ourselves accountable, how do we reflect and really think about power and privilege, how do we think not only of our own personal relationships, but also how do we fight to mitigate the systems that structure injustice, particularly with colonized, Black communities, with Indigenous communities. So cultural humility, I feel like, means something to a specific group of people and is speaking to a specific group of people. So I'm aware of that, and I think the work that we're doing here, I think really we want to be naming colonization, and we want to be naming white supremacy and racism as ideas that structure our experiences, and structure the community music as a field of practice and as a field of scholarship. And so I want to name those things up front. And maybe at this point I'll turn it over to Teoti and Kelly, and let you take it from there. Does that seem right?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Yeah. Great. I personally, I'm going to speak to some reflections I've had on this, because otherwise I won't stay in time. But having said that, I am going to start with just a question of location, but also of practice, because Nate Holder said the other day in the first assembly, which I thought was really profound for me, it was really quite a light bulb moment. We've moved from the, a lot of white people have moved from being interested in things Black and Indigenous to a need to know things about this. And that was quite an interesting, that was a really interesting notion, because in our journey in my country, in New Zealand, but also I'm looking backwards at the people who have made change in my environment for Indigenous, you can't do it without the culture of power, because they are the ones who can change systems. So it was really interesting that Nate said that. I really appreciate that. And coming into the system, just to explain what I opened with a prayer that is, or a karakia, we say, a blessing, pre-Christian, but the goal of it is to bring us all together with the intent of having an outcome that is beneficial to all of us and to our communities. And I'm mindful of that as I go through this, because we don't translate. In New Zealand, that is normal practice. We do it, white people do it. White people also locate themselves in Māori. So we have a bicultural understanding and a bilingual obligation to do this, and it's standard in our education, our government, and lots of other places. And I fully realize that this is unusual. I appreciate that this is unusual globally, but in New Zealand it's quite normal, but it hasn't been. It wasn't when I was a child, but it is now. And so you'll notice that I didn't translate, I just said it, and that is normal practice. Likewise, my introduction in locating myself, I didn't describe it, but I'll talk about that a little bit more as I go through. So let me just muse and reflect, so that I give space to Kelly, because I can't wait to hear what she's going to talk about. And so as I've already indicated, the nature, for me, understanding the nature of collective identity is central to understanding how Indigenous communities interact and build relationships. And when I'm asked to participate in anything, or do anything in the arts community or in my university position, my reaction is, how will this impact my community? Will it lift my community? And I don't mean to romanticize that, because I certainly consider things like fiscal outcome and will it impact on my watching Netflix? You know, I do think of these other considerations, but I have learned a set of parallel values to the colonial model that shapes New Zealand mainstream culture. And it's a set of models that were modeled, a set of values that were modeled by my elders. And to understand this collective identity is to understand the socio-political outcome of historical trauma in my context, and how these things have shaped my collective's ideals and aspirations. So I connect that now just to my opening introduction of myself, when I located myself, which was in the Māori language, and was directed at my ancestors who have passed, and other Māori who may be present in this environment, because it establishes my genealogical relationship through physical landmarks, the canoes my descendants came on from the islands, the land they lived on, and the landmarks that are part of our tribal narrative. And this allows people to make connections to me or to my family or my wider community. And when this relationship is established, we can reconcile any past histories that may need to be addressed. And when we've cleansed that space, then we can move on. And this is fundamental to many Pacific cultures. We have some wonderful Pacific Island researchers at my institution, Dr. Melanie and and they speak with various methodologies. And they speak to this notion as te lava, which is cultivating or nurturing of the space between. And it refers to relationships and how the flourishing of each person is supported by the quality of that relationship, and is a constant negotiation of that space between them. And I bring this up because we in New Zealand are at an interesting place in our journey to decolonization, or negotiating that space between. In New Zealand, part of that is giving Indigenous culture equal status with the settler culture, which is an aspiration we had agreed to under the terms of our colonization with the British Crown, but is very much a work in progress, which brings me to the institutional context. So in the Asia Pacific area, many university schools of music are considering how to combine the traditional with the progressive through community music making, with a particular view on curriculum development. This shift in curriculum design has the potential to transform the learning culture of a university music program and has special significance for those of us whose communities' musics have not always been included, and in some contexts were deliberately excluded and historically suppressed. In New Zealand, we have Māori institutes of high learning called wānanga that provide higher education within an educational framework built around Māori aspirations, values, and cultural practices. And this allows us self-sovereignty and mitigates the need to negotiate space between cultures. And increasingly, there has been an interest in mainstream universities to integrate Māori music traditions and practices into our curriculum. So in considering this, and I've reflected on this quite a lot over the last few years, the role of Māori situated in mainstream universities, and there aren't that many of us, but we're there, it can be complicated. We understand the history of appropriation. We understand that Indigenous community music making is often connected to community wellness, to life rituals, and other significant ceremonies, and needs a specific framework to ensure all cultural protocols are met. We also need to look at the capacity of our staff to provide appropriate frameworks for the transmission of these traditions and consider the quality of the relational space between the School of Music and Māori communities. Enacting culturally responsive and appropriate learning practices can challenge and disrupt dominant ways of knowing music education. And I ask myself, is it worth the energy, psychological and otherwise, to support the cultural power through this type of epistemological shift? I say that because I've been doing this for a long time and I'm quite tired. So I asked myself some questions. What is in it for my collective? How would this benefit my community? And the reality is that our language and practices are vulnerable through cultural suppression and language loss. And that is why community music making has been so crucial for my people. It has been a tool for cultural revival, sustaining languages and music practices. So I sort of end these musings with these questions. Maybe we need to consider, meaning Māori, do we need the cultural power in order to revive and sustain our music traditions? I mean, it's an interesting question. Another question is, who become the knowledge bearers in times of historical trauma? Is it through a partnership between the settlers and through their higher learning institutions? Which is a really provocative question in my context. Is the space between our School of Music and Māori community musicians too cluttered with historic issues to build a strong partnership? Again, something to be considered. Is there still some cleansing of that space still to be done? So I leave you with those reflections, those provocations. Kia ora tātou katoa, and I pass it on to Kelly. Mute.
Gotta remember that mute. Thank you, Teode. I really appreciate what you had to say, and I saw a lot of connections between your talk about values and just how, you know, what benefits the community, what's in it for the community. Research has to be community relevant for the people because so much harm has been done through colonizing research processes and theft of knowledge. I have called it, and other scholars call it too, epistemic violence. And so as a newer researcher, that really makes me cognizant of how I did my research. And so one of the things, I guess, from your conversation, Teode, that I want to just say a statement is, if I don't know you, and the you is anyone who's listening, if I don't know you, I don't know how to relate to you. And so that is why it's important for people to locate themselves in order for us to put connection to how do I relate to in the conversation? What do I need to fill you in on because you may not know, or what kinds of questions need to be further explored. And it also is a trust thing too. And then when a relationship is established, we kind of know where to proceed from there. And in my research, which is really a contested kind of research, and I've mentioned it in other places, but I certainly felt the silence in my research all around, really, because settler peoples didn't really know what the big deal was of doing a research project with police, a singing police group and Indigenous women and girls. They just thought, oh, that's wonderful, but they didn't know the issue, and Indigenous peoples didn't want to talk about it. So I received silence there as well, because they often would say to me, or give me the look like, why are you partnering with the police when there's so much violence? And I guess relationship is what it was for me. And when I asked the women and girls why, of their drum circle, because I was a song carrier, and all of the participants, I knew them all. And so I wanted to do right by them in my research study. And when I asked the women and girls why they chose to stay in this partnership that had been going 5 years at the time in my research, they said that they wanted it to be better for their children, to be able to call the police if they needed help, because certainly it's known that you don't get into the back seat of a police car, and don't call the police because they're not going to be able to help you. So when I think about the space between, when I first started my research and thought about doing a PhD in my later part of my life, I had seen many Google pictures of, when I Googled Indigenous protests, that's the words that the media uses, I would probably say land protector. But Google would show these faces where the Indigenous person is right here, and the military or the police officer is right there. And I started thinking about the space in between my hands, or their faces, was filled with so much animosity that they knew the other existed, but they didn't know really anything about the other. But they acted as if they did know the other. And I'm probably thinking more so the police and the military, and what they've learned in history. And so I wondered what the space would look like or feel like if they started to recognize each other. And so that was my research. And a really interesting study that prompted me to create a lens in my research was done by Errol Berg and John Sloboda in 2010. And their title of their article was Music and Art in Conflict Transformation. And those authors, they looked at the audience impact of two adversarial singing groups singing together. And their research study found that the audience was not as optimistic about what was transpiring with the singing partnership as the actual singing partnership members themselves. And so I became sparked by the idea of, well, what if we actually went on the enthusiasm of the partnership, because they're believing that there's something there to be had. And so I turned my lens to look at the Indigenous women and girls and the police chorus, who are white settler males singing together, and what was happening over this 5 years. And so in that ethical space, it was, there's been thoughts of this kind of term as early as the 1970s, and actually even earlier by Kierkegaard, but Roger Poole kind of coined the term, and Willie Ermine, who's a Cree educator, used that term in 2007 to talk about how Indigenous and settler peoples know each other exists, but they really don't know each other, and how there's this undercurrent of animosity there that never gets addressed. So when our singing partnership had been happening for 5 years, It's like, what kept it together? So there was a foundation of, and this is through lots of storytelling, and I use sharing circles for separate for the women and girls and separate ones for the men so that they'd feel more comfortable sharing. And they talked about a genuine willingness to engage, that they knew there was something more than just an entertaining kind of partnership. It's like, yeah, I think I really want to learn something here, or I want to know more. There was that. There was also, over time, a feeling of responsibility and accountability. Responsibility to show up, to stay engaged, and maybe to step out into some discomfort or do some homework on learning. And accountability too, recognizing that anybody's words and actions could hurt another, so they were accountable. And that, again, that had come out over 5 years of when I asked them, what do you think made this work? And interestingly, I may have shared this in another circle, but I asked them a question. I asked the men, the white settler male police course men, would you have done this research if you weren't in this partnership? And they all said, probably not. So it's quite telling. And I have to say, it was song. It was song. We loved, our drum circle loved singing. Never thought we'd do it with the police. In fact, we wouldn't have engaged with the police with anything unless it was song. And even then, I can say the women and girls were really reluctant in the beginning, but they said, well, if Kelly thinks it's a good idea, all on my shoulders. So I was very cognizant that, there's been harm done there before, and we didn't want that to happen in this group of men. And the last area is mutual reciprocity. Is I realize settler peoples in partnerships have to do the greater work. And that is what it is, because the harm's been done by settler white people. And I think the police chorus recognized this, and they stepped up to do things. They did what they were asked, and they did not take the lead. In fact, during the research, they said, well, we knew we shouldn't take a lead. And then there were some other values that maintain this relationship. And so I didn't plan this, but I guess when I look at the world from an Indigenous perspective, I can't help but organize my research according to my worldview. I didn't know it was going to happen this way, but it came out that it was the Anishinaabe 7 teachings, that there had to be a care or love for working with each other, and there had to be truth, which is truth of not denying the history and the colonization that's happened, even not denying the whiteness, the supremacy of whiteness that's there, being a settler and being honest with oneself about those things. And I tell you, that was hard for the men who had they really didn't learn much in their schooling about Indigenous peoples. And also courage to step into the uncomfortable, to have respect, and then humility, which is not stepping up unless asked, because it's very common for the dominant white society to kind of take a lead on things or think that they may know how things need to go, and the men recognize that they weren't taking the lead. And wisdom is just really an accumulation of new knowledge that they were learning, and which poked holes in the knowledge in the beginning, because they admitted they did not know what the big deal was in this partnership. And so it was only through our conversations, getting together for rehearsals, that this learning process started to happen. And maybe I better stop there.
I don't know, I feel like the conversation's just like rolling. As I'm curious, like, Teoti, you talked about the culture of power, and I scribbled some notes down as you were talking, but like lots of provocative questions, but the idea of like, is partnership possible is partnership necessary in order to reclaim or revive the culture, right? So I'm thinking about that in relation to Kelly, what you just spoke of this ethical space that you didn't use the term partnership, but that sort of the collaboration, the singing collaboration between two groups of people who never collaborate that I know of. Like, this is the only example that I know of. So I just maybe would invite, I don't know, Teoti and Kelly, if you want to like take a couple minutes to just talk. I mean, that's just what's top of my mind. There might be something else that's much more top of your mind. So that's just a suggestion. But I'd like just give the two of you space to just to chat through what you heard from each other.
Well, I mean, what immediately springs to mind is your last comment about mutual reciprocity. Really, the idea that the cultural power has to do more work, and we have to bring that to their knowledge. Although they sort of begin to realize that when they engage with things Indigenous, and they are brought to it. So part of what I do, Kelly, in Auckland, is that we have enhanced our community music teaching program. Actually, we've enhanced our studio pedagogy program, which became community music program, because we were sending our students into the community to facilitate and to teach, and they really had no idea of things Indigenous. And so a lot of our training has been, or enhancement of training has been, around them reflecting on that, reflecting on their experience in studio, and reading research that has been done by Māori and by our Pacific minorities, which are our cousins in this country. And all of it has been done by Māori and by Pacifica on Māori and on Pacifica, as according to, we're very fortunate. Some of you may know Decolonizing Methodologies, written by Linda Smith, this really important book, one of the first that came out. And of course, she's here, and she's, you know, so we cannot move a step. Nobody of any culture can move a step without citing that book. And her husband, whose thesis was in that area. And it's been really fortunate for us. It's really changed the dynamic of, for example, our choral organizations and our chamber music nations, and all of these different things now have a new value system that is built in part on the Indigenous, and they often have bilingual documents, and they often now more openly go into communities and provide opportunities that tell our stories with us. And I mean, it's been huge amount of work for them, and they've been fiscally motivated because there is funding for it, for sure. But at the end of the day, that has been the charge, and that has the work they're doing in our arts organizations and in our community music is that. And I think that's really, I mean, I think that's incredibly important. So I welcome that comment, because I think that I can see in my own context that they are working harder. They have to work harder. Okay, and coming back to the need versus the interest, for a long time they were interested in it, and now they absolutely have to. And it's been fascinating for our culture, really. Sorry.
Just to add a few thoughts on there too. Deanna had wondered if there was other research done anywhere, and that, I guess, is part of my dissertation and my own research. I could not find any other research anywhere in the world that was doing a sustained partnership between Indigenous peoples and the police. There are one-off ones, but nothing longer term. And so that does speak to certainly the adversarial nature there, and the violence that's there. And I guess for me, I'm a peace person, and I guess I hold hope. I hope it's not just the pie in the sky kind of thinking, but from an Indigenous teaching, though, you know, elders have guided me that everybody is part of this creation, part of this circle of life, even the adversaries, the people who've done violence. And so I think about, if we're all to be part of this circle of life, how do we change that? And the only way I know is to build relationships and rapport. And we can only do that when we're in some kind of space together. And song happened to bring us together. It wasn't even a figment of my imagination. I just happened to see a booth at the college where I was working at the time, and I saw the word police chorus, and I looked and go, oh, the police, and I kept on walking by. I didn't even stop. And then later that day, the booth was still up, and I believe Creator stopped me, and because my feet stopped, my mind was going, get back to your office. And I turned, and the man at the booth was looking in my direction. So I felt compelled to go over to him, and I was a little awkward socially, and I said, so do you sing? And of course, a police chorus must sing. That we had a laugh, and that started to open a door, and you'll never guess what. I discovered that this man who was leading the Waterloo Regional Police male chorus was had just finished a 2-year task of overseeing over 100 staff who recorded the stories of the survivors of the residential schools.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and
Wow. Wow.
I just that turned it for me, and I thought maybe there's something here. And so that his energy had actually, when I saw the rest of the chorus, I felt that his energy was working through them. And so I had hope there too. And I told the women and girls, and that I think was a game changer, that they thought maybe this guy knows something about our history. And it is so right. I was at an event. Actually, the police chorus and our drum circle were singing at a residential school that had closed in Brantford. And you can imagine the conflicting feelings that survivors might have had with a police chorus being on the land and presence of a residential school. Because police would have been the ones to take children back to the school if they ran away. And but an elder came to me, and she was quite upset after this singing event, and she came down to see me by the fire, and she was wagging her finger, and she said, I saw those men singing, and when I saw those uniforms, I was going to just leave and go home. But she said, and she started to cry, and she said, but then I saw how they looked at you. And she said, maybe I have hope. So I felt there was a disruption in how she had always thought about police officers. You know, I'm sure it didn't change everything for her, but it's like it disrupted her way of knowing police. She saw kindness, she saw respect, and there's so many stories, but I would agree that settler peoples, the homework has to be there. They have to do it, and because I guess it's a case of they don't know what they don't know, and they may not know until they start unraveling this information. And it can be exhausting for Indigenous peoples if they're always the teachers. And so there is homework that they can do to learn that. Thank you.
Thank you. That feels like a wonderful segue to move to Nikki. It will start with Nikki and then Jillian, but I feel like whoever is a settler who does her homework, I think it might be Nikki. So,
Thanks, Deanna.
Yeah, over
Hi.
to you.
Kelly, I just wanted to jump right off of what you just said, that you don't know what you don't know. Kathleen Absalon has that right in her book, and she's got a book about her Indigenous methodology called How You Come to Know. I read it, and it was pretty profoundly impactful for my own research. My research has been, well, on a surface level, it was just I worked with the Indigenous leads at our school board to run workshops for music educators to bring Indigenous perspectives into the classroom, because a lot of music teachers were the only people in the school to teach everybody. So we're huge community builders, we're really important, and nobody gets that except us. And I had built really strong and long-term relationships with the Indigenous leads because I'd been working really hard towards allyship as an educator. And so based on that, we built these workshops, but the workshops were not the real learning, the really important stuff. And I think it was watching the educators in the workshops transform themselves. As we did 2.5 hour sessions with follow-up interviews, which were about an hour each, and everybody in the workshops participated in the interviews. And every single one of those participants talked about the impact of the workshops on their own worldviews. And also every single one of them said almost exactly, I didn't know what I didn't know, in their reflections. And it was like every time that I did an interview, that sentence gave me like just complete chills, because that was exactly how I feel. Like doing this work is uncomfortable. It's very uncomfortable. It should be uncomfortable, right? Because as you said, like it's our job to do this work, and it is uncomfortable because it's coming to realize that all the systems that are in place that I've, oh yeah, I've hard work has got me. No, not just hard work. It's all the systems that are in place to lift me up and to make me have all the privilege that I do have. And so coming to reckon with all of that, and then as an educator, realizing that I am potentially upholding and continuing those systems, and how do I break those down when I'm physically working in a colonial building, in a colonial system, in a colonial practice, and everything I'm doing is in a colonial like physical space. And Nicole Robinson, the Indigenous lead at our school board, she says you can never decolonize education because it is a colonial construct, right? The whole thing. But you can decolonize like thought processes and ways of being. So that's kind of what I've worked on. And I thought a lot about both of what you just said has been kind of what I've been living in this uncomfortable, important place for the last like 2 years or so. So I just want to thank you, because I've learned so much from this conversation already. And I think that the importance of being uncomfortable and never feeling like you've got it, because you're always going to be wrong. And it's probably a sign that you need to do a lot more work. And then recognizing and constantly checking my own self against my Indigenous colleagues and collaborators, and my own motivations and my intentions. Am I doing things in a good way? Am I doing things from a good place? And being uncomfortable all the time, and being okay with that. So I aspire to work as hard as I can to do that work and to be an ally. So.
Jillian, would you like to join in from your perspective?
Yeah, and thank you, Nikki and Kelly and Teoti. I think that what I'm interested in talking about is sharing a little bit of, or not sharing about the project that I've been working on. I'm involved in as a community musician working in a remote community in the northwest of Australia. So it's it's 6 hours flight from where I live. So and then 4 hours drive inland. It's a long way. And I point that out to make a point of that distance, of that geographical distance, but also this is such a large landmass. It's a completely different environment as well. And I've been working there in a small township that is majority Indigenous. And of course, I can't travel there at the moment because we don't have internal travel allowed at the moment due to the pandemic. It brings to the fore, though, for me, the relationships that I have with the people I collaborate there with. So I work a lot with young people in the school system, but I also work with Indigenous language teachers, and we've been developing songs and songwriting and soundscape work over the last few years. And particularly in the last year, that work has really flourished, which has made me, brought more attention and put more of a spotlight on how important those relationships are to me. And so the navigating that I'm doing is often a navigation around, actually, I'm going to interrupt myself. I'm finding it really useful to think about relationality, but also about extractivist mentalities. I'm very aware and very conscious of my country, Australia, has a long, deeply embedded culture of extraction. And we see it in our resource sector. We see it in the way that in the sorts of aid and support we offer to other countries in our region, where we often support them to extract resources. It's a culture that is about discovery and extracting what it is that you need. And that is, in a way, it's admired. There's a moral value attached to that. because it supports efficiency. And so we're so accustomed to working within these timeframes. And I feel very conscious of that when I, given the distance that I have from my participants or my collaborators, I think of them as my collaborators in this very faraway township. How can I ensure that the relationships that I'm forming, I'm not forming in an extractivist way? I found it a very powerful word to have in my mind, and in a way, as Nate asked us on Tuesday night, to think about where our defaults are. My defaults might often be around that sense of, I want to honor this relationship and create space for these relationships and allow them to form in this organic way that they do form when I'm up there. But at the same time, I'm carrying the expectations of the organization, the arts organization that I work for, which is embedded within this larger structure system of grant proposals and letters of support and timelines and timeframes and deadlines and delivery and products and outputs and reporting back and describing and doing that quickly. And then they are also within a larger structure. And then at the same time, I have a full-time job in a university. So I am also I'm interested in working with my collaborators to examine what we've been doing, how these songs emerge, what they mean to the community. I can see them being used when I'm not there, these songs that we've written that are now being used in various forms of activism, for example, locally. And I can see the way that the language teachers have jumped on the possibilities that these songs might offer them to embed more language learning into the songs, and then that does what sort of support that might be offering them in their programs. I hope that it is offering support that is useful and valued. I'd love to be having these conversations with them. The project doesn't necessarily allow that time. Connecting remotely doesn't really work for a whole host of reasons to do with how complicated life is there. And this is not necessarily a priority project. It's nice when it happens, but it's not necessarily something that is a priority in the midst of otherwise very busy and complicated lives. So I'm also aware, again, thinking about Linda Smith's work and that very first, opening sentence, I think it is in Indigenous Methodologies book, or Decolonizing Methodologies, is that research is one of the dirtiest words in the Indigenous world. So there are conversations I want to have. There are conversations I'm keen to have. I can't have them right now, so I'm thinking about it a huge amount, which makes this conversation with all of you so very welcome and stimulating. But it's an interesting space to be in as well, because just as we ask our Indigenous students or Indigenous population to be constantly navigating this white settler world, and it being imposed upon them, there's a navigation of two worlds that's constantly being asked to happen. And I can also feel myself in that discomfort of the two worlds, and very willingly, and welcoming its challenges and welcoming its lessons, but at the same time very conscious that there is a navigation, and there is a care, a huge care that I want to take to protect those relationships above all else, and that every day that can bring up a question for me. Do I want to be the person to be chasing down letters of support, for example, if that's not the relationship that I've built with my collaborators? I wouldn't normally contact them out of the blue to say, can you do this letter and can it be done in 2 days? It's like, I don't know, I want to have that as my relationship with them. I know I don't. So those are that's my thoughts. But for others in my situation, I have found it very useful to use this idea of the value of extractivism or extractist. I'm still working out what the adjectives and adverbs are going to be with that word, but to work out when they're going to arise and what they look like, what that looks like when it hits me in the face, and when it inserts itself into a project in these different ways, being ready to be alert to that.
Great, thank you, Jillian. I don't know if anyone has anything, either questions or a comment at this point, or maybe I should turn it over to Gerard and then we can open it up. I think over to Gerard. Yes, please.
Okay. Well, this has been absolutely wonderful and fascinating, and it leads me to almost as in my own life, in real life, like maybe I just won't say anything because there's such a wonderful dialogue already happening right here between what seems to be extremes. And of course, with Black Lives Matters, the world has been tumbled into this, and that we are all now placed at extremes, and other people place us in these things. And so I'm going to pick up, a couple of threads of from what you've said. And I'm really here as someone who realizes, I mean, it's taken me like 50 years to realize this, that it's because I grew up in California and it's not a real place. That's what, it's just like, it doesn't seem like a real place. And I grew up a minority there, but remember back then, decades ago, we had affirmative action. And then we got into the 80s, and suddenly in the papers, and I give this to my Music 100 students in their lessons, there's this article that says, now Chinese people, or Asians, it said, now all Asians are white. And in fact, and then affirmative action was dropped. UC Berkeley stopped giving, counting Asians as minorities. And it was, and it affected the perception of even journalists, where they would see an academic panel like ours here and say, oh, everyone's white, even though 3 people were Asian. So it's a weird, weird place to grow up, and then to move across, and then the country to Washington, D.C., and then also then to move to Canada, where the multiculturalism has been a focus for so very long. I wasn't truly racialized until I moved to Canada. And that just might be a matter of being confused, but it is a confusing place to be. So picking up both on Kelly's and Jillian's and Nikki's talk about education and these ways of thinking, or cultures of extraction, cultures of reduction, right? Reductionist culture as well. And also the deconstructing culture, that taking something apart, like someone's culture or someone's music, and then gluing it back together somehow helps you to understand it better. What we find is it really doesn't, because everything's contextual, right? But I have gone through all of these processes in Western training, and then in traditional training in music and different cultural forms. The funniest thing, Kelly, when you and I were teaching together last year, and we had second year students with us, and one of them said, when Kelly asked what if any of them had been exposed or knew anything about Indigenous culture, and one of them said, well, yeah, in grade 4 I had to do a diorama. I had to put these Indigenous houses and people and things into like a little scene. So you had never heard of that, right, Kelly? And then what the weird thing was, and then every student said that, oh yeah, I had to do a diorama. This reducing of someone's entire, it was bizarre, but reducing of someone's entire culture into, well, essentially a soundbite, right? Into a funny little box you're going to bring to school and say, well, there's where the people live, and what are they doing now? Well, they're eating, and so this very strange way of trying to compact cultures. We do this with music too, and especially with choral music, we're really horrible about it. And I guess I should cut to the chase of what I'm talking about with these cultures, and being a brown person or an in-between person. I'm not always that. And I do function quite a bit as an Indigenous ally. And interestingly, as I analyze that, Kelly, and in the different ways of allyship, I was actually talking to a flute player today, First Nations flute player. That was great. I'll fill you in on that. And I also have to function as an ally on the other sides too, of the extreme. And I don't know if it's the brownness, or that people in their perception have to take a look at me and then push me to one side or the other. Are you this or are you that? I think it's always negotiated in the space. And then I had a really weird experience in a car with a friend who said, I just don't see you as any color, because he sees me as completely normal. His normal is a colonized normal. And so I have to wonder about that. And so it's incredibly confusing. Like, you can't just come home at night and turn on Netflix. Well, I guess you can, but there's a lot of reflecting that goes on with that, with similar experiences of settlers, shared experiences, and shared experiences of people migrating, forced migrations, and similar experiences of people who have had land and property taken from them, internment, that kind of thing. And there's tremendous cultural traumas within my background, and that my elders, my parents and such, they just won't talk about, and grandparents would not talk about. And so the in-betweens, whether it's the Southeast Asians or whether it's the first wave of Chinese or Indians, or however we divide them up, occupy this interesting place. And it's a huge majority place. Like, they will be the biggest population in North America in a few years. So it is a place of great potential. That's how I see it, because I think I'm an optimist even after all these years. And I have to add to that even the police violence that's been brought out into our minds in the last few weeks, that this brought up a very early trauma of mine. I won't tell the whole story, but that it was something from when I was 5 years old and was mistaken in my white community for a black child. And yet it involved a police officer and a gun, but I was 5 years old. It was very bizarre. So these things run deep, and they run in the background, almost like a background program for a lot of us. What I think, though, in an optimistic sort of way, is allyship. Is that because of the shared experience on all of these different sides, is that the potential to participate in allyship is very, very high amongst people who are in-betweens. They can relate both ways. They can listen both ways. Or I guess training and listening is sort of everything. And that's sort of the message I really wanted to work on. A lot of my work in this that I've come to with ethical space that I work with comes from Kelly and Willie Ehrman. Also in a culture of hope, this radical center. It's the radical middle where all things exist. That's where the real activist has to live, and not in the extreme. So I feel kind of dumped there and put there. And so I both share a lot of experiences as someone who has been colonized, but also and migrated, immigrant, but also and settled, but also someone who has functioned in that colonized system pretty well for the most part. So I think I'm going to stop it there, and then I would love to get a discussion going, see what everyone else has to say. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so would I. What strikes me as I listen is not just like the being in relationship is a focus, but actually that in betweenness, right? That's come up a few times around that there's the space that forms that relationship in a way, right? So I'm thinking about well, Gerard, you characterize yourself as the in-between, right? So that you actually are in that space. And Kelly talking about that the ethical space, and Teoti, the nurturing the space between. Like they're not the same thing. I'm not equating them as the same thing, but there's something there. And then the sort of insider outsider, or some of the differences that we're trying to navigate in that are in that space, right? And I'm thinking now of Nikki's and Jillian's sort of considerations, and I put my thinking through from my perspective too, around what does it mean to do my homework, to be accountable, to show up, that discomfort, and the trying something and getting it wrong, and maybe being called out on it. And yet to still show up, actually, like to feel the shame and to say, no, actually that's on, I need to feel that, and that's something that I need to think about and work through, and I need to still show up, and and to do what needs to be done, and not take up too much space, right? All of these navigations of that space in between, and those negotiations. So I maybe would invite, I don't know, could we be a little chaotic and all kind of come off mute, and just invite like what you're. I know it's so not Zoom-like. I don't know. Maybe it won't work. Maybe we'll have to mute ourselves.
Well, I was just
yeah.
thinking, Gerard, it's so interesting. In New Zealand, the most common surname now is Singh. And the second most common surname is Lee, L-I. So, you know, it was so interesting when you said that, because I'm like going, And in our context, it's so interesting when we talk about these, you know, that we have a bicultural obligation. The Indigenous and the settler culture are the two that have shaped, that shape everything. But it's so interesting. The uptake in Indigenous protocols and has been most common, and I say this because my partner is American, amongst immigrants, newer immigrants. They understand it, they get it, they come here and they join our history, as complex as it is. And so, you know, if you go to I speak Māori, but not completely fluently, because I speak 4 languages better. But, you know, when I go and observe Te Reo Māori classes, Chinese, Indian, Italians, you know, everyone from everywhere else in the world, and occasionally somebody who's descended from a white it's a really fascinating place. But I wanted I'm just going to, I'll shut up in a minute. I was just going to say, one of the things that came up in a Twitter that I was reading on somebody's Twitter comment was about intermarriage and the representation of us, and how in New Zealand there's a fabulous book, which I cannot remember off the top of my head, written by Ranginui Walker, who's one of our great Māori academics. And he wrote about how a strategy for Māori to survive and sustain cultures was to intermarry. And so miscegenation is really a colonial sort of strategy for us. Hence, and I talk about this with Jillian all the time, we come in very many different shades because we're a very friendly people. And in fact, at the School of Music where I teach, the Māori students that I have, and we call ourselves, School of Music is SOM, so we call ourselves the 50 Shades of Māori, because we all have different levels of understanding of the language. We have different levels of, different spaces that we occupy, but we all have a Māori name, and we all have that label, which sort of puts us into this group. But part of the success in New Zealand has been the intermarriage, because the space is suddenly here. And, you know, you have a cousin who is Māori, you have a cousin who's, and it goes further in that many of my cousins are married to Chinese, many of my cousins are married to Samoan. So in the Polynesian realm, we're very intermarried, and it does change the notion of the space. And I just wanted to say that. And what I'm taking from today, though, I love the way you said reductionist, because I was thinking about that with regard to social media and how we need, you know, a lot of our work has been around changing the public narrative. And what is more reductionist than going to a meme? And, you know, that is so often the way we are represented. And changing that, Black Lives Matter has changed that. I mean, it's completely changed that. There's a completely different public narrative out there now. And I think that's a really positive thing. And I'm going to use extractivist. We need to find the right word, Jillian, and write it somewhere so I can cite it, because that's a great term. That's really interesting. And even I, as a Māori researcher, I need to be careful that I don't conform to the Western paradigm and accidentally start working in that manner, because I think sometimes that can happen when we have objectives that are not defined by us. So yeah, so I welcome all of those. Wow. I'll shut up now.
Thank you. That's so wonderful.
I just another thought I had about extractivist mentalities or mindsets is that often in devised music projects, we also go into those with an extractivist mindset, or participatory work in general. It's not unusual, it's not ideal, but it happens that you go into a community and you seek to take things from that community that you can use in this music project. You know, we need to question those practices, and especially if the project already has this predetermined outcome. So I think the idea of this extraction or extracting, it applies very broadly, and which is why I find it so powerful for myself.
I think it's a really good point, and it goes right along with sort of the worst types of appropriation, without using the word of appropriation, but I like this the extractionist term as well. One of the worst types I encounter is the type of person who wants to take something from a culture, music, and then claim mastery of it. It's a weird thing, but we get it a lot. We certainly get it along, you know, ambitious musicians. I'm going to master every world instrument. I'm going to do this or that. And they, by removing it from the culture and then determining or creating a form of mastery or a definition of mastery that it's perhaps completely different than its original context. So that it's something that I think we really do need to address in a bigger way. Yeah, it's good.
Educators, like at every level, it's really something that we've been kind of ingrained with, is like, you go to a workshop, or what can I take home? What's that, like, you know, you do your workshop, what can I package up and do for a lesson on Monday? And so that's ingrained in us right from the beginning, I think. And you know, when you're taught a song, you're doing it for a performance, you're doing it for a thing, and it's not just the experience itself. And I think that feeds into that extractionist piece, right? Like we can't just be in a song or be in a place. We have to like take it, and what can I do with this later? So that's something I have to work on as well.
Yeah, and there were some experiences too with songs that have been in the colonial history for a long time, and that they've been adopted by musicians, and where thought isn't given to the origins of the song or the actual meaning. I can think of some songs, like there's a popular one in Canada called the Huron Carol, and it really is, it's a story of assimilating the Indigenous peoples, and yet you know, it's sung as if it's an endearing song to the Indigenous people, but it's actually one of a lot of harm. Or 2 years ago, Canada had the 150th celebration of being a nation, and so many Canadian songs came out about the beginning and settling of the land, but a total disregard or no knowledge of Indigenous peoples, and so, you know, that has done a lot of harm as well. But also, Gerard, I was thinking about identity, and I mean, I agree with Deanna too, that there's a couple conversations happening here with regard to the space between, because identity too, I don't know, Homi Bhabha did a lot of research and work around identity in third space, and how people of different cultures, and he was primarily looking at Indigenous and settler peoples, and how there's a new identity that comes when you have a mixing of the peoples. Although I would probably say that Indigenous peoples aren't so much wanting to look for a mix of identity, but you see that in all kinds of hybrid music that come out nowadays, with fusion music and those things. So it's another interesting negotiation of space that can happen. And I think, you know, more people, like, it's actually two separate combinations, and yet I recognize in myself I have an identity that, because I actually didn't mention much about my 30 years of knowledge of Anishinaabe teachings, and I can't even erase that from what I know. And some elders just say, accept that you know it, Kelly. And so that's part of my identity too. And yet I realize I have this settler heritage in there too. And so I think a lot of us walk with those conflicting identities, but in a way they may actually help us to see in between the spaces, you know, and to negotiate them in different ways. And I love it that you said entering this space in between is actually like an action piece or activism. So entering into an ethical space, it requires a doing. Like, it's not about just learning and becoming more informed, but actually a doing. And I really think that's where things are at right now with Black Lives Matters, with the Indigenous peoples in protecting their lands and Indigenous rights, is that they're not standing on the wayside, they're doing. And as settler peoples, you know, maybe our question to ourselves is what are we doing? Because we're all in the nations where we're from, you know, where we might call home. Can we just be passive recipients of our lives? Is that privilege? And maybe we need to move from that privilege to build equitable and just relations.
Yeah, hear, hear.
Wow, that's well said. I think you're right, though. It is it's an activating space, and it's really hard to stay passive, and it's kind of really hard to hide there. And as a researcher, I started work in intercultural ethics. Back then I called it cross-cultural ethics, a couple decades ago. And it's been a really difficult it's been a difficult research journey, certainly. There's things that people don't want to talk about. There are many narratives going on, but perhaps this, I like this entering into the space and that it's an activist space. Certainly, my experience with you, Kelly, and with the drum circle was very much like that. And also now that we have in our community music program and the master's program, of course, we have some really powerful activists. And it really it ups our game. It really is a huge challenge for me, but one that I'm very grateful for.
I am aware of our time, and I'd welcome if anyone had ideas how to close. What I'm thinking is to bring it back to the field of community music. Actually, it's a nice segue from Gerard where you landed there. Is like, you know, if you were to speak to the field of community music as it is today, whatever that means, whatever context you're working from, you know, what's the thing that you want people to hear right now? Is that a good question? Is that a fair question to be asking?
Well, I suppose it would be.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead. No, go.
I'm sorry. I was about to say. I suppose my question for community music activities and just a general community music in these organizations, particularly, is as a dynamic group, is it a culturally safe space for Indigenous people to participate in and tell their stories? I suppose that's one question that I have ongoing. And certainly one of the reasons I supported DIME, Decolonizing Indigenous Music Education, or indigenizing, because I wasn't entirely sure, but it is the only place that I feel comfortable telling my stories. And so, but that's me, and I wonder, and that's where my country is at the moment. You know, it's a safe place, and I just go everywhere assuming it's safe everywhere, and then I find it's not. So my question would be to the wider community of, because, you know, there's no universal Indigenous, we're all at different stages, and we're all decolonizing in different ways. Is it a safe space? So we have to ask ourselves that.
Maybe a thought for me is, because I do a lot of work around reconciliation and often working with settler peoples and trying to understand the history in Canada. And settler peoples really are not used to not knowing. You know, life operates according to the ways they know the way of society should be. It just is a natural way of knowing, and they haven't had to feel uncomfortable about being in situations of not knowing. So I guess my thought for them is risk not knowing, and I think that could be awesome for singing partnerships or other singing arrangements, is kind of venturing and discovering as we go.
I'm wondering if we have questions or provocations for the countries that are colonized, that have a history of colonizing, but aren't necessarily a settler nation. UK is the top of mind, but I don't know if I have a question, but I'm wondering if that is something we want to consider, because we all come from settler colonial societies.
Perhaps I have something to add to that. This goes with what both Kelly and Jillian and Teodi have said, and it maybe is too much of a challenge. I don't know. In CMA or in our community music, can we create practices that are truly open and compassionate? I'd like to use the word anti-racist, but I don't know if that's the right word, right? But come up with that language and then actually form practical practices, not just standpoints or positions. That's easy to do. And I think in our world, most of us don't actually believe most of the words that are coming to us now. We question them. But when people have long-term practices of allyship or collaboration or supporting one another, that speaks volumes. And creating those safe spaces, I think, could come out of some pretty well-intentioned and well done, well carried out practices with all the mistakes that comes with practice.
I think my personal contribution or whatever would be my call to action, I think, would be for non-Indigenous peoples to look inwards and to do the work on yourselves before trying to do collaborations. Because I think if you haven't done your homework, if you haven't done your reading and your courses and you're listening to podcasts and all of the things that you can do to at least begin to kind of unlearn what you thought you knew, then you're not going to be entering into collaboration in a way that's going to be helpful to both sides. So that's something that I think is really important. And also to consider, as Teodi and Kelly have both mentioned, the burden on the Indigenous communities, because often they're a smaller percentage of the population in Canada. It's 4% and growing. So, there might be one person in the room, and so the burden on like the Indigenous leads at the school board or the Indigenous leads in the universities and stuff is really heavy. And so finding the balance between doing this work, as much work as possible yourself, while also checking in with those Indigenous colleagues and trying not to create the burden, and then making sure that it is a reciprocal relationship. So for example, I'm doing a Laurier project right now in the Faculty of Music, which I want to talk to you more, Teodi, about. But it's in collaboration with the Student Center, the Indigenous Student Center there, and their collaborators, because they're looking ultimately at ways that they can support Indigenous students in the Faculty of Music. So they're involved in the project, and it is reciprocal that way because they're getting something out of it as well and are involved in that. So I think, being mindful of the burden that we're putting on Indigenous populations as this need and this want and this desire to be better allies is so present of mind right now that we need to really be conscious as well of the burden that we're placing on these communities. Yeah.
Beautiful.
Yeah, here.
Yeah, beautiful.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm sorry, was it Jillian? Was that you? Go ahead.
Yeah. The first point, Nikki, that of getting your, looking inwards first and self-reflection prior to collaboration. I'll just speak freely. It reminds me of the sort of relationship advice you can get that says, until you really sorted all your shit out, you shouldn't try and be in a relationship with somebody else. And I think that it can be it can give a paralysis. And so I'm interested in Kelly and Teodi's thoughts about that. Is that paralysis, that there's a balance to be struck perhaps between the recognition of what you don't know and seeking out that knowledge, not from your collaborators, but through what is available and already out there that you could read and engage with or listen to. But what's the point at which you also need to act and not let yourself be paralyzed by what you don't know?
I'm aware of there are different kinds of learning circles. Sometimes settlers will get together after they've done a little bit of their own homework and talk with each other about what they've been learning. It just so happens that I do a course on reconciliation. It's for community people as well as for students, and it's two separate courses, but it's a way, because my identity, as you know, is it's Indigenous, but I really can't speak for the Indigenous people in Canada because I'm Sami, and yet I have an understanding or insight about their needs because it's similar to the Sami people, even though I've been born here. So I feel like, in a way, with me facilitating courses and we talk in circle, that people get to ask questions in a space where maybe they might feel shy to with Indigenous, North American Indigenous peoples. And so it becomes a forum that they're able to start to ask a question, or I didn't know that, or what did you mean when you said doctrine of discovery and the land is stolen? and so it becomes a place that they get to further their reading, or I'll give them readings and go ask them to take that away and bring it back. Because I do agree with you, you can feel paralyzed or maybe isolated if you're only interpreting yourself, and you lose the ambition or motivation to read. And so I think working with others, you know, to sort some of that out can be really helpful.
I agree with that. I think one of the most useful things when I first came into academia was working in collaborations and working in multicultural collaborations, because as long as you have an agreed way, and in our sort of area, we have this thing called Give Way protocol, which is a Pacific concept where everyone gets to talk about everything and all the data and just ask curious questions. And then at the end of it, if there's a decision to be made or a protocol to be made, we give way to the person with the lived cultural experience. But in that process, you get to see how these things come and why they are, the rationale behind them, all of that sort of stuff. And so I'm really, I mean, that's the action for me. And at the moment, I'll give you an example. I'm on a, can I mention it? Oh, it doesn't matter. I'm on a research project with 2 Australians from Queensland University Technology. And it's so interesting because I was very much a last minute participant, but it was because I'm Indigenous and they needed someone. And I was aware of that. But I knew I needed to be there because I could make a difference in their research design and also in the communities and the networks. And it was going to benefit my community. Didn't have the time, but it's going to benefit my community. And so, but it's been fascinating because they just have a whole, every meeting, there's just a whole load of questions for them to ask me. Because they don't know and they want to know. And you know, that's really interesting. And I'm certainly learning from them as well. But clearly they don't have that safe environment where they are, but they found it with me over here in New Zealand, because we're about 3 hours flying time away. And that was interesting to me. It was really interesting to me. But it's a collaboration that works because we are sharing information and knowledge, and neither of us are afraid to say whatever we want. I can tell them when they're doing racist bullshit. You know, it's fine. You know, it's okay. And they have enough cultural humility to know what they don't know. And that's amazing to me. That wasn't what it was like 30 years ago when I began my university life.
Wow.
I'm sorry, Jillian, I don't know if that answered it, but anyway.
But it's just, if we're thinking about action, then we probably need to think about the paralysis that can come from uncertainty. I actually really liked as well somebody, maybe it was Diana, who said earlier about being able to continue showing up. Right. Is probably action. Well,
I think, I'm sorry, I'm just mindful of time, but certainly one thing we have a conversation about here is that people feel like they can't say something or they shouldn't say something. And I always respond with, well, that's a good thing, because for much of your life, you've said too much too soon without any evidence and assumed that you're right. And, you know, it's actually, I'm relieved when you actually pause, stop and consider. That's not a bad thing. And so it depends what the paralysis looks like, I guess, for me. And it is our burden, if you want to look at it, to guide them out of it and feel comfortable with it, because ultimately that will give them knowledge. And for us in our language, we have this, and it's interesting, we have many different values, but one of the key ones is manakitanga, which is, interesting enough, if Lee Higgins is watching, means hospitality. And you know, we have a responsibility to everyone, including settlers in this country. We don't call them settlers, we call them guests, because they arrived after us. And we take care of our settlers guests, but we take care of everyone who's come into this country since there. And this is one of the ways we would express hospitality, is by guiding them through that process of feeling paralyzed and sharing with them.
And knowing that we will screw up epically, and then having to just push through that awful experience. Like, I think, Deanna, you said that earlier, right? Yeah. I can give lots of examples of those screw ups.
Yeah, that's right. And still show up.
I love that sense. Oh, I'm sorry. But I love that sense of care. Yeah. Too, and it changes the whole narrative, which is why these cultural narratives, our narratives, need to come in, because they change the whole public narrative in always positive ways.
Try to imagine in Canada what the conversation would be like if we said guests instead of settlers. Like,
Yeah.
That definitely completely shifts my understanding of my relationship to the land, right? In a way that actually is way more honest.
Yeah.
You know, settler still has like the colonial project.
Yeah.
You know, Terra Nova is built into the settler, right? Guest is.
But there's a lot of pushback on it because they look at it with a Western framework. But if you look at it within the Māori framework, it's an honor. So, you know, it just
Right.
depends how you look at it. You know,
Yeah.
but,
Yeah.
Wow.
Lovely.
Beautiful.
Well, we covered a lot of territory. I feel like the thing I didn't get to say, the thing that I would want communities to hear, I've been wanting to say, and I've not been gutsy enough, but is that is the colonization through the intervention model of community music is something that I feel like it's time to push back on that, and it's time to recognize that that there is that as a very particular model that comes from a country that has colonized a number of countries around the world.
Yeah, thank you.
And that and that really understanding the relationships of insider outsider, the cultural power, right, and the you know the like whose music are we talking about, and you know, like, are there actually communities with no music? And you know, I don't know, there's just a lot of those questions that I think are buried and embedded into the intervention model that are tacit and aren't spoken. And I hope that the conversation we're having today actually pulls those out, and that we're finally naming them and recognizing actually there's lots of ways that community and music intersect in ways that could make a meaningful difference, but also shift the power relationships. So.
And maybe hearing some of these conversations from settler nations would be a good reminder for people who are from the dominant settler original countries that it's as important for them to learn their histories and the damage that has been caused around the world as a result, that as it is for us to be dealing with it.
Yeah.
We could cut this out of the recording,
I
but
don't know. I'm just like,
or maybe in a discussion afterwards we could raise it. But you know, one of those things that I think the intervention model links to the professionalization of community music. The UK is the country where it is most professionalized.
right.
Yeah.
There are a lot of advantages that come to the people who identify as professional community musicians. We don't really use the phrase community musician in Australia at all, unless you really want to diminish yourself in terms of as a musician. So I think it's interesting that there could well be a connection between those two things as well, because of course one of the ways you can justify and legitimize your work is if you are positioned slightly at a distance from those you will work on or with, which supports the professional structures, the structures that say there are boundaries around this, you know,
which is the opposite of all Indigenous methodologies.
And it's a debate that's in music therapy as well, in terms of the community music therapy model in relation to clinical music therapy, what the role of those boundaries is.
I think in the community building language, it's that over-reliance on expert. We just suddenly somebody's labeled an expert, and then it sets up those boundaries, part of that same culture.
Yeah, it's interesting being at in Laurier. I feel like we're on the precipice of you know, having this undergraduate program in community music, that sort of idea that term could then produce a professional class that means something in the, you know, at the moment it doesn't, like, it's a bit like community music might mean something to some people and not to others, and you know, it's not like, it's nowhere near organized the way that the United Kingdom is, but that this program has the potential to do that professionalization work and reify something that maybe shouldn't be. You know, so I'm aware of that. It sort of feels,
wow.
Yeah. Wow, I knew this was happening. 9:30. The conversation gets interesting. I mean, it's been interesting all along. You know what I mean?
I'm just wondering how you're going to cut this down, Deanna.
I know that the Director's Cut podcast is like 2 hours long.
Send it out to everybody in advance. Like, you just have to watch the full 2 hours and check in, and we'll have the conversation. I don't know what I'm going to do.
Thank you. Thank you
Good
all.
That's beautiful.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you
You're all
very
beautiful.
much.
Yeah.
And we'll
Thank
see you
Thank
soon.
you for your song, Kelly. Yeah.
Beautiful,
Yeah,
Kelly.
yeah.
Beautiful.
And
All right. We'll be in
cleansing.
touch soon.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.